What is the worst cheating story you ever heard? A Marine I was stationed with gave his fiancée a general power of attorney before he deployed. The whole time he was deployed, another Marine was staying in his house and driving his truck. By the time he came back from deployment, she had sold 2 of his vehicles, gave away his dogs, trashed his house, and wiped his bank account clean. Was there any legal repercussion for her? Nope. That power of attorney allowed her to do just about any transaction on his behalf. He gave her that authority with that document. Of course, he didn't expect her to take him to the cleaners while he was deployed. My ex-girlfriend had a friend that had this happen. This was in a large, multi-building housing complex in Central Europe. Her husband had to go away on business and was to be gone for a week. One night after midnight she hears the door open and in walks her husband with an empty trash can and wearing his slippers. No suitcase. Turns out, he did not go away, but was seeing a woman in the same complex. He had a few drinks, was tired, took out the garbage and in his fog, returned to his own apartment and blew his own cover. They divorced. I had just started a new job, and was sitting in the office to finish up some paperwork with my supervisor. As we're talking about things, a guy walks in, looking sheepish. Our supervisor asks him where he's been. He hadn't come into work for 3 days. This launched my new co-worker into the craziest story. He started off by saying he was in Hazard, taking care of his mom. So if you're from Kentucky, a little town up in the mountains called Hazard has a bit of a reputation. That was my first clue that this was not going to end well. So his mom, she abruptly wanted a divorce, and had just attempted suicide. See, that would have been enough, Absence explained, but this dude proceeded to tell the whole story. His parents had been happily married for a couple decades, which is why she was so completely blindsided. His mom had picked up the house phone, and overheard her husband in the middle of phone sex with his sister. When confronted, he admitted it had started when they were teenagers and they wanted to be together. So she now had to face the fact that for their entire marriage, her husband had been cheating with his own sister. It's not my story, but the 7-Eleven cheating story is pretty bad. It has been posted a few times on Reddit. Essentially, there was a guy who worked in the towers, however on the day he didn't go to work but went to a girlfriend's. He had his phone off because he was with her. Apparently at noon he turned his phone on to frantic calls from his wife. She asked him where he was and he said the office, on one of the top floors. Not as bad as most of the others, but it made me so fucking sad when they told me. Basically, I know a guy whose father died in a car crash on the way to the hospital, where his wife had just gone into labor. He was supposed to be at work, but the crash didn't happen anywhere near the place where he worked. So it was that his newly widowed wife, who'd just given birth to her first child, found out her husband had been cheating on her while she was pregnant, and had just left his mistress' house when he died. Okay, so back in the day my former stepmother was produced in a union between a lot lizard and a truck driver. About 30-some years later, after she's married to my dad, she decides to try to find her dad. After looking and looking and looking, she finds a guy who remembers her mother, and the dates and locations match up. Baby daddy found. So, she and her bio dad get talking. And talking. And talking. Talking moves to dirty pictures, and dirty pictures move to plans to meet up. My dad found out about the dirty details when she finally told him she wanted to leave him for her dad. I'm not sure exactly what happened, but my dad and former stepmom were together for 2 more years until they finally broke up. In high school, one of the seniors, male, was dating an 8th grader at the time. They dated for a couple of years when the girl discovered something unsavory. He and her mother were going to town and she walked in. The mother and he are married now. Can't imagine how that feels for the girl, now early 20s. Before I started dating my ex, he was cheated on by his fiancée a week before they were supposed to move into a house together. He found out by her leaving a used condom in his mailbox. Back in the mid-80s I worked with a salesman, Stan. Stan was married to his high school sweetheart. They were from eastern Kentucky, and her family was pretty big in the coal industry, so they were pretty well off. During general office chat he mentioned his wife Laura several times, and had a photo of a pretty blonde on his desk. One day, close to lunchtime, the pretty blonde from the photo came in. When I encountered her, she introduced herself as Jan and said she was there to see Stan. He came out of his office and greeted her affectionately and they left. I was a little confused and said to a nearby coworker, "I thought he said his wife's name was Laura?" The coworker replied, "His wife is Laura, Jan is his girlfriend." Turns out that Stan had met Jan several years before when he managed a fast food restaurant she worked at when she was 15 and he was 26. They started their affair shortly after. Apparently her parents had no problem with the situation, her room was where they had sex most often. Then one day it came up in conversation that he had taken her to her senior prom a couple of years earlier. He was driving a cab at the time and simply told his wife he was working an extra night shift. Then he went to his girlfriend's house and got dressed up and he took her to her prom and they partied the night away in a hotel room after. His wife would drive home and spend the weekend with her parents every few weeks. Occasionally he'd go with her but most often he'd give some excuse as to why he couldn't go, and then his girlfriend would come over and play house for the weekend. An acquaintance caught her husband in bed with her mom. Stopped talking to her mom, split but then reconciled with her husband. Husband was later accused and convicted of raping a co-worker. He served minimum time. They are still married. Well, my brother's second ex-wife went to get a tattoo to celebrate their 11th year, I think, together. Ended up sleeping with the tattoo artist. After she got the tattoo. Then had this tattoo artist's baby. My family is a trip. My granddad was married to his first wife. They had like 5 kids. I can only name one, Kenneth. He will come back up later. Something happened, he and first wife get divorced and he marries my grandmother Gloria. Gloria has 5 kids of her own with granddad. During this time, first wife has 3 other kids spaced between Gloria's kids. All look like my granddad. In fact, first wife drops off the youngest at Gloria's feet and says, "You raise him." The names are similar too. They're Joseph and a Joel. Pretty fucked up. I have a lot of family I've never met. So flash forward to Kenneth. Ken marries his wife, has 3 kids with first wife. Is deployed to Vietnam for a couple tours. Between 2 tours, doesn't come home, goes to California, finds random girl, hooks up and has a kid. He goes back to Nam and doesn't hear from her for 20 plus years. So 25 years later, I'm in boot camp in the Corps and my PMI, primary marksmanship instructor, has my last name. It's not common. After a few conversations it becomes clear my PMI is my long-lost cousin and Kenneth's son, who after finding out, leaves his wife and moves back to California to be with this lady. Then there's my dad, who I found out had at least 4 different side chicks during his 20-year marriage to my mom. Including one girl I went to high school with. My grandfather cheated on my grandmother with multiple women. Then left. My mother sees him again a couple years later when she is really young and is excited to see him again, and basically ignored or did not recognize her. He comes back years later and talks to my great-grandfather and grandmother saying how's it going? Like nothing happened, and while he brings his new wife and kid to the house, who did not know he was married before he took them to their house. They, his wife and daughter, come back years later and she explains he basically did the same thing to her. And he upset and confused his daughter by mixing up her name with my mother's. He later moved back in the area and one day my uncle, who remained close to him, calls him and says you're going to have to take me to the hospital. And my grandfather responds by saying I'm busy doing something unimportant, but let me know how that goes. Then hung up. So yeah, my grandfather is an asshole. A guy I know has been fucking his best friend's wife for years. The first girl to show me any affection at my new school, went out with her, things were going fine. Then found out she was also dating her girl best friend. So she had a boyfriend and girlfriend. The girlfriend and I came to a sort of understanding and all was okay. Until I needed to use my girlfriend's phone for something. She was in an active sexual relationship with another guy that her other girlfriend knew nothing about, and he knew nothing of us. She'd also been talking to this guy for a month or so before I was seeing her. She promised to break up with him about 4 different times. She did, and then got back together like the next day. So to recap, my girlfriend of a few months had a girlfriend while she was dating me. She was also in a sexual relationship with another different guy who other girlfriend and I knew nothing about. The kicker about this? A year later she posted on Facebook saying I have to decide I want to have surgery to become a man, also I believe in polygamy, brought everything nicely into perspective.